Right now, as you are watching this, your SSD could be quietly dying, and your computer is giving you absolutely no warning about it. No error message, no flashing light, no sound. Just silence, right up until the moment your drive locks up, your files disappear, and you realize there is no getting them back. This is not a horror story about rare bad luck. This is what happens to a significant number of SSD users every single year. And the reason most of them never saw it coming is that they believe the same myths about SSDs that almost everyone believes. They thought SSDs were built to last. They thought the drive would warn them before it failed. They thought that as long as their computer was booting up and running programs, the storage was fine. Every single one of those assumptions is wrong. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly how to check whether your SSD is already showing the early signs of failure, what habits might be quietly accelerating its death right now, and what you can do today to protect everything stored on it before it is too late. The first thing you need to understand is that your SSD has a fundamental physical. Every SSD is built around something called NAND flash memory, which stores your data by trapping electrons inside tiny floating gate transistors. Writing data to the drive is an electrical operation, and every single time that operation happens, it causes microscopic, irreversible damage to the oxide layer inside the memory cell. This process is described in terms of what are called program-to erase cycles, or PIE cycles. Each cell in your SSD can only be written and erased a finite number of times before it degrades to the point where it can no longer reliably hold a charge. The analogy that comes closest to capturing this is writing on a piece of paper with a pencil and erasing it over and over. At some point, the paper wears thin. With NAND cells, that worn thin state means the cell eventually forgets the data stored in it, which is not a software problem. Update an app, run an operating system process, or even just leave your computer on. The type of NAND inside your SSD determines how quickly this wear happens. And this is where the difference between cheap drives and more expensive ones becomes very real and very important. The most common type of NAND in consumer SSDs today is called TLC, which stands for triple level cell. TLC stores 3 bits of data per cell. That sounds efficient, and it is, but it comes at a cost. TLC NAND can typically handle between 300 and 1,000 write cycles per cell before degradation becomes significant. The next tier down, increasingly common in budget drives, is QLC, or quad level cell NAND, which stores 4 bits per cell and typically handles even fewer write cycles, sometimes as low as 100 to 300. MLC, or multi-level cell, which stores 2 bits per cell, can handle around 3,000 cycles and is found in mid-range and higher-end drives. At the premium end, SLC, or single-level cell NAND, handles between 50,000 and 100,000 write cycles. But it is expensive and rarely found in consumer products. The drive in your laptop or desktop right now almost certainly has TLC or QLC NAND inside it, and that matters enormously when you understand how quickly those write cycles can add up. To help consumers understand how long their drives should last, manufacturers use a measurement called TBW, which stands for terabytes written. This number represents the total amount of data that can be written to the drive over its entire lifespan before the manufacturer can no longer guarantee reliable performance. A typical 1 TB consumer SSD might have a TBW rating of somewhere between 300 and 600 terabytes. That sounds like an enormous amount of data, and for a casual user who browses the web and watches videos and works with documents, it often is. A user writing around 10 gigabytes of data per day would take decades to hit that limit. But the problem is that TBW ratings are calculated using standardized workloads. They, TITO, do not reflect what many real users actually do with their drives. If you game heavily, video game installations trigger enormous amounts of write data through patch updates, save file operations, and shader caching. If you edit video, a single project can involve writing and rewriting hundreds of gigabytes of data repeatedly. If you run virtual machines, use intensive creative software, or simply leave your system running processes in the background that write constantly to the drive, your actual daily write load can be 10 to 20 times higher than the assumptions behind those TBW calculations. There's also a phenomenon called write amplification that most people have never heard of, and that quietly accelerates SSD wear far beyond what users expect. Here's how it works. When you save even a small file, say a 1 megabyte document, the SSD cannot simply write that 1 megabyte to an empty cell. So if the block that needs to be updated contains other data, the SSD controller has to read the entire block into its cache, erase the whole block, modify the relevant portion, and then write everything back. This means that your 1 megabyte save might actually trigger 3, 4, or even more megabytes of actual physical writes to the NAND cells. This ratio between the data you asked to write and the data the drive actually wrote to complete that operation is called the write amplification factor. And on drives that are heavily filled, poorly managed, or running intensive workloads, that factor can be dramatically higher than 1. Every 10 degrees Celsius increase in operating temperature can cut SSD lifespan in half. Write amplification on a drive, running hot inside a compact laptop or a poorly ventilated desktop case, is a combination that wears NAND cells far faster than the TBW rating on the box would ever suggest. Now here is the thing about SSD failure that makes it genuinely dangerous in a way that old mechanical hard drives were not. When an old spinning hard drive was starting to fail, it usually told you. You would hear clicking. You would hear grinding. The drive would get unbearably slow. You would have time to notice something was wrong, time to copy your files, time to buy a replacement. SSDs have no moving parts. They make no sound. They do not vibrate differently. When an SSD starts failing, it does so in ways that are either invisible or easily confused with software problems. Files might take slightly longer to open, but that is easy to attribute to a program update or background processes. A file might save and then turn out to be corrupted, but that is easy to blame on the application. The computer might crash occasionally, but that is easy to blame on Windows or a driver. The drive is failing the whole time and giving you every excuse to look in the wrong direction. In some of the worst cases, SSDs fail with no warning whatsoever. One day the system boots instantly, and the next day the drive simply does not appear in the BIOS. When an SSD controller chip fails catastrophically, there is no gradual slowdown, no read-only mode, no recovery window. It is gone in an instant, and recovering data from a failed SSD at a professional level costs anywhere from several hundred to several $1,000s with no guarantee of success. There is a specific failure mode that is particularly treacherous for laptop users. When an SSD in a laptop is consistently running at high temperatures. Because the chassis design does not allow adequate airflow around the storage components, the wear on NAND cells accelerates dramatically. Modern NVMe SSDs, the FASTM2, drives found in most current laptops and desktops, generate considerably more heat than the older SATA-based SSDs they replaced. An NVMe drive operating consistently above 70 degrees Celsius is being exposed to thermal stress that shortens its life in ways that the TBW rating never accounts for. Many compact gaming laptops, thin ultrabooks, and even some desktop builds have M.2 slots positioned directly next to GPU or CPU heat pipes, and without dedicated heat sinks on the SSD itself, temperatures during heavy workloads can easily exceed comfortable operating ranges. Most users never check this. Most users have never even thought about it. Their SSD is cooking quietly in the background while they work, game, and stream, and the only indication something might be wrong is a system that starts running the cooling fans harder and more often than it used to. So what do you actually do about this? The answer starts with checking your SSD health right now, today, using tools that exist specifically for this purpose, and that take less than 5 minutes to use. The most important of these is called Crystal Disk Info, and it is completely free. When you open Crystal Disk Info, the first thing you will see is a color-coded health indicator at the top left of the screen. Green means the drive is healthy. Yellow, labeled as caution, means something worth paying attention to has been detected. Red, labeled as bad, means you need to stop what you're doing right now and back up every file on that drive before doing anything else. Below the health indicator, Crystal Disk Info displays your SSD temperature in real time. For SSDs, you want to see temperatures staying comfortably below 70 degrees Celsius under load and below 50 degrees when the system is sitting idle. If your idle temperature is already above 50 degrees, your drive has a cooling problem that needs to be addressed. The most important section of Crystal Disk Info is the S.M.A.R.T data table, which stands for Self-Monitoring, Analysis, and Reporting Technology. This is the built-in health reporting system that modern drives carry. The raw values in this table are what you should focus on, not the current or worst numbers. The single most critical attribute to look at is called reallocated sectors count, sometimes listed as reallocated sector count or similar. The raw value for this attribute should be 0. It should always be 0. If you see any number other than 0 in the raw value for reallocated sectors, it means that your drive has already detected damaged NAND cells and has been quietly moving data away from them to spare S-sectors in the background without telling you anything. A raw value of even one reallocated sector is a serious warning. It does not mean your drive is about to die this second, but it means you should treat that drive as already compromised, back up everything on it immediately, and start planning its replacement. The drives that techs see, brought in for recovery, are almost always ones where the reallocated sector count climbed slowly from 1 to 10 to 50 to hundreds, while the owner kept ignoring the yellow warning and hoping the drive would stabilize. It does not stabilize, it progresses. The second attribute to watch is called current pending sector count. This represents sectors that the drive has flagged as potentially defective and is waiting to test further during the next read or write operation. Even a raw value of 1 in this column is a warning sign worth acting on. The third attribute is called uncorrectable sector count, sometimes labeled UDMA CRC error rate on some drives. If this number is rising over time, data is being lost during transfer operations in ways the drive cannot correct, and that is a serious reliability problem. Beyond these 3 critical attributes, also note the power on hours value, which tells you the total number of hours the drive has been running, and the total host writes, or similar attribute, which tells you how many terabytes of data have been written to the drive over its lifetime. Comparing the total writes to the drive's rated TBW gives you a rough sense of what percentage of the drive's write. Endurance has been consumed. If you have already written 200 terabytes to a drive with a 300 terabyte TBW rating, you are in the final third of that drive's guaranteed lifespan and should be monitoring it closely and maintaining a current backup at all times. Samsung, Western Digital, Crucial, and most other major SSD manufacturers also offer their own first-party software tools called Samsung Magician, WD Dashboard, Crucial Storage Executive, and so on. These tools often provide a cleaner and more readable interface than Crystal Disk Info for their respective drives, and they also give you the ability to update your SSD's firmware directly. Firmware updates are something that a very large percentage of SSD owners have never done and have never thought about, but they matter. SSD firmware controls the wear leveling algorithms, garbage collection routines, and error correction processes that determine how the drive manages its NAND cells. Manufacturers release firmware updates that fix bugs in these processes, improve endurance management, and address specific failure modes that field data has revealed. An SSD running outdated firmware is missing optimizations that could meaningfully extend its life, and in some cases is exposed to bugs that cause premature failures. Open your manufacturer's SSD tool, check whether a firmware update is available, and apply it if one exists. There are also several common habits that quietly shorten SSD lifespan that are worth addressing specifically, because most users are doing at least one of them without realizing the effect. The first is keeping the drive nearly full. SSD wear. Leveling and garbage collection algorithms require free space to operate efficiently. When your drive is more than 85 to 90% full, these background processes become constrained, and the write amplification factor increases significantly. The rule of thumb that most storage professionals recommend is to keep at least 10 to 20% of your SSD's capacity empty at all times, not just to avoid running out of space, but to give the drive the breathing room it needs to manage wear effectively. A 1 terabyte SSD should ideally never exceed 800 to 900 gigabytes of used space. This is not excessive caution. It is the way the drive is designed to be operated. The second common habit that damages SSDs faster than people expect is excessive use of the Windows hibernation feature, particularly on desktops where it serves little practical purpose. When Windows hibernates, it writes the entire contents of RAM to the multiple hibernations per day across years of use, adds up to a surprisingly large chunk of the drive's total write budget, consumed on a process that could be replaced with simple sleep mode, which does not write RAM contents to disk. On laptop systems where hibernation serves a genuine purpose for battery conservation, this is reasonable. The third habit is never updating SSD firmware, which we already covered, and the fourth is ignoring temperature. If you are using a laptop with an NVMe SSD and you routinely run it sitting on a bed, a couch, a blanket, or any other soft surface that blocks the ventilation on the bottom of the chassis, you are exposing your storage to sustained, elevated temperatures that measurably shorten its lifespan. Use a hard flat surface or a laptop stand that allows airflow. If you are using a desktop with an M2 SSD and the drive sits without a heatsink in a case with poor airflow, adding a simple M2 heatsink, Celsius. Given that every 10-degree reduction in temperature can approximately double the lifespan of NAND cells under thermal stress, this is one of the highest return investments you can make in the longevity of your storage. Backups deserve their own moment of honest discussion here because the single most dangerous mistake SSD owners make is treating health monitoring as a substitute for backup. It is not. Crystal Disk Info is excellent at catching gradual wear-related degradation. It is completely useless against controller failure, firmware corruption, physical shock damage, and certain catastrophic failure modes that give zero smart warning before the drive goes dark. Real-world data recovery technicians consistently report cases where SSDs showed 98 or 99% health in their last S.M.A.R.T check days B before total failure. S.M.A.R.T monitors wear. It does not monitor everything that can go wrong. The only protection against sudden unannounced SSD failure is a current backup stored somewhere physically separate from the failing drive. Not on the same machine, not on a second partition of the same SSD, on an external drive, a NAS, a cloud service, or ideally some combination of these. The 3-2-1 backup rule recommends 3 copies of your data on 2 different types of storage media with 1 stored off-site. That standard exists because storage professionals have seen enough catastrophic data loss to know that no single drive, no matter how new or healthy it appears, can be trusted as the sole keeper of irreplaceable files. The practical checklist for what you should do after watching this video comes down to a handful of specific actions. Download Crystal Disk Info and open it today. Check the HE-ALT status color, the temperature, the reallocated sectors count, the current pending sector count, and the total host writes value. Note those numbers and check them again in a month. Open your SSD manufacturer's software tool and check for firmware updates. Look at how full your drive is and clear space if you are above 85% used. If you are on a desktop, check whether your M2 SSD has a heatsink and add one if it does not. If you are on a laptop, stop using it on soft surfaces that block airflow. And set up a backup routine right now, not eventually. Not when you have more time, not after you figure out the best system. Right now, even if it is as simple as copying your most important folders to an external drive today while you think through something more comprehensive. The reason this matters urgently is that SSD failure does not wait for convenient timing. It does not warn you before a deadline. It does not give you a grace period when you are in the middle of a project that matters. The 5 minutes it takes to download Crystal Disk Info and read its output is the cheapest insurance you will ever buy for your digital files. Most people who lose data to SSD failure never suspected anything was wrong. The ones who check proactively are the ones who get to say they caught it in time. Check your drive today, not tomorrow, today. The broader picture worth stepping back to see is that SSDs have fundamentally changed how most people think about storage reliability, and not entirely in a positive direction. With old mechanical drives, the physical drama of failure made the risk feel real. You heard the sounds, you felt the slowdown, you understood something was breaking. SSDs erased all of that feedback and replaced it with invisibility, and in doing so, they created a generation of users who assume their storage is fine because nothing has told them otherwise. That assumption is the most dangerous thing about owning an SSD in 2025 and 2026. The drive does not speak unless you ask it a direct question with the right tool. Crystal Disk Info is how you ask that question. Smart data is the answer the drive gives back. The gap between checking and not checking is the gap between catching a problem while you still have options and discovering a failure when your only option is expensive professional data recovery or permanent loss. Close that gap today. The files on your drive are worth 5 minutes of your attention, and 5 minutes is genuinely all this takes.